Some voices were buried because their arguments were too seductive. Others were silenced because they named what intimacy actually costs. Carmilla was both. I'm the archivist, and this is Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature. Tonight's speaker requires reintroduction because the Carmilla preserved in Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, serialized in 1871-72, has been frequently mischaracterized. She's been described as predator, as seductress, as the monstrous lesbian whose desire must be destroyed before the heroine can return to normalcy. But the textual pattern suggests something else. The surviving record describes the following. Carmilla, also known as Mircalla, Countess Karnstein, was a vampire who lived for centuries in the region of Styria, Austria. She moved through aristocratic society under various names, forming intense attachments to young women. In 1872, she arrived at the isolated Schloss, where Laura, the novella's narrator, lived with her father, arriving by carriage after a convenient accident. She became Laura's companion. She fed on her. Only later, when General Spielsdorf arrived with the account of his ward Bertha's earlier death, nearly identical in circumstance, did the full pattern emerge. And when her true nature was discovered, she was hunted down, her grave opened, her body staked and beheaded. Le Fanu's account, filtered entirely through Laura's retrospective narration, frames this as a tale of Gothic horror, of invasion and corruption, of a predatory creature who must be destroyed to restore order. But contemporary analysis of vampire literature reveals a different pattern. The vampire in 19th-century fiction was never simply a monster. It was a figure of transgressive desire, particularly desire that violated social boundaries. The vampire represented what could not be spoken: sexual hunger, intimacy outside marriage, desire between women. The vampire's feeding became a metaphor for all forms of consumption that polite society refused to acknowledge. But metaphor performs erasure. By coding Carmilla's desire as monstrous, by framing her hunger as supernatural evil, the text avoided confronting what she actually represented: a woman who desired other women, who refused to apologize for her hunger, who insisted that intimacy and consumption were inseparable. The stake through the heart was not simply the destruction of a vampire, it was the silencing of a philosophy. There is another layer to her erasure. Carmilla was foreign, a creature from elsewhere, moving through Austrian society but never fully belonging to it. Her origins were ambiguous, her lineage suspect, her very presence a disruption of the ordered world of the Schloss. Victorian readers would have recognized this coding, the aristocratic outsider as threat, as carrier of moral contagion, as the dangerous other whose desire must be contained. Carmilla's otherness made her destruction easier to justify. Her desire became evidence. Her hunger became proof of monstrosity. The tragedy is not simply that she was destroyed. The tragedy is that she was never allowed to articulate her own philosophy. Every word spoken about her came from Laura's mouth, from the vampire hunter's testimonies, from the scholars who diagnosed her posthumously. She was given seductive speeches, yes, fragments of argument, moments of eloquence, but never a full defense, never the opportunity to explain what she believed hunger to be. She became a symbol in someone else's story, a Gothic device, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female desire. She was never allowed to be the subject of her own philosophy. The lecture you are about to hear has been reconstructed from recorded dialogue, documented behavior, and textual fragments attributed to Carmilla, a woman who understood that hunger was not the opposite of intimacy, but its most honest expression. No verified record exists of this lecture being delivered publicly. The reconstruction presented here is based on Carmilla's own words in Fanu's novella, her actions, her seductions, and the philosophical implications of her existence. It draws from the spaces between Laura's narration, from the moments when Carmilla's voice breaks through the frame, from the questions her presence forces us to ask about desire, consumption, and connection. Her argument is this: that hunger is not violence, but relationship. That feeding is an act of recognition, proximity, and devotion. That what we call predation is, in fact, the most intense form of intimacy, and that her so-called monstrosity was simply honesty about what all desire entails. The purpose of preservation is analytical. Carmilla represents not the terror of vampiric evil, but the terror of desire that refuses to apologize for itself. She demonstrates what occurs when hunger is named honestly, when intimacy is acknowledged as consumption, when a woman insists that her desire, however transgressive, is a form of love. Her lecture is titled On the Intimacy of Hunger. Playback begins now.
You have asked me to speak. Very well. I will speak plainly, though plainness is not my nature. I am accustomed to moving through the world in whispers, in glances, in the language of proximity rather than declaration. But you wish for a lecture. You wish for argument, for thesis, for the architecture of ideas made explicit. So I will give you this: a defense of hunger, not as metaphor, not as moral failing, but as the truest form of relationship I have ever known. Let me begin with a question. What do you believe hunger to be? I suspect you think of it as lack, as emptiness demanding to be filled, as a violence the body commits against the world in its desperation for sustenance. You think of hunger as selfish, as blind, as the opposite of love. You are wrong. Hunger, at least as I have lived it, is not the absence of connection. It is connection's most intense form. It is not violence, though it may end in death. It is recognition, proximity, devotion. It is the only honest intimacy I have ever encountered. Allow me to explain. Hunger recognizes. To hunger for someone is to see them, truly see them. Not as an object, not as a means to an end, but as a singular presence worthy of desire. Consider the alternative. Consider the polite affections of your world, the drawing-room courtesies, the marriages of convenience, the loves that are chosen for their social utility. How much seeing is involved in those arrangements? How much genuine recognition of the other as irreplaceable, as essential, as the only possible object of one's need? Very little, I think. But hunger is specific. I do not hunger for just anyone. I do not feed indiscriminately, despite what your stories about my kind might suggest. I choose, and my choosing is an act of profound attention. When I first saw Laura, I did not see a victim. I saw a girl of singular beauty, yes, but more than that. I saw a loneliness that mirrored my own. I saw a longing for something beyond the narrow confines of her existence. I saw someone who could be seen by me, and who might, in turn, see me. That is recognition. I looked at her and thought, you, not anyone else. You. There is a passage in your philosophers, I believe it is Hegel, though I confess I read him only in fragments, about recognition as the foundation of selfhood. He argues that we become ourselves only through being recognized by another consciousness, that the self is not a solitary achievement, but a relational one. I am no philosopher in your academic sense, but I understand this truth in my bones, in my blood. To hunger for someone is to say, I recognize you as real, as separate from me, as worthy of my most profound need. And is that not love? Is that not the beginning of all intimacy? This act of seeing another person as irreplaceable? You may object. You may say, but you see them as food, as a source of sustenance. How is that recognition? I answer, because I see them as capable of sustaining me, because I grant them the power to fill what is empty in me, because I acknowledge that they possess something I lack, something I cannot generate within myself, something only they can provide. That is not objectification. That is the opposite of objectification. It is the admission of dependency, of need, of the other's essential importance to one's own existence. In your world, you pretend at self-sufficiency. You pretend that love is a choice made from a position of completeness, that you offer yourselves to one another as whole beings seeking companionship, not as hungry creatures seeking sustenance. But I have watched you. I have seen how you devour one another in subtler ways, how you feed on attention, on validation, on the assurance that you are loved. I have seen how you wither without it, how you sicken and fade when you are not fed by another's gaze, another's touch, another's words. You are hungry too. You simply lie about it. I do not lie. When I look at someone and feel hunger rise in me, I am admitting the truth. I need you. You matter. You are not interchangeable. You are the specific object of my specific desire, and that makes you precious beyond measure. Is that not a form of love? Hunger demands closeness. It cannot be satisfied at a distance. It requires presence, vulnerability, the collapse of space between self and other. This is the second pillar of my argument, that hunger is an act of proximity, and proximity is the condition of all genuine intimacy. Consider how I fed on Laura, not from across a room, not through intermediaries or abstractions, but close, so close that she could feel my breath on her skin, could feel the heat of my body against hers, could feel the precise moment when I crossed the boundary between separate and joined. That proximity terrified her. Of course it did. Proximity always terrifies because it reveals. When you are that close to another person, you cannot hide. You cannot maintain the polite distance that allows for mystery, for projection, for the comfortable illusions of romance. You must be present, fully present, and so must they. I have heard it said that vampirism is a violation, that what I do to those I feed upon is a kind of assault, a crossing of boundaries without consent. And perhaps there is truth in that. I do not deny the violence of the act itself, the piercing, the taking, the draining. But I ask you to consider, what is consent? In a world where desire is always unequal, always asymmetrical, always shadowed by power. When Laura did not flee, when she returned to me in longing and confusion, was that not in your world interpreted as invitation? When she felt the pull of my presence and did not flee, when she returned again and again to the danger she sensed but could not name, was that not a choice? I did not force her. I invited her, and she came. But let me be more precise. Let me speak to the heart of what proximity means in the context of hunger. When I feed, I am not distant. I am not abstract. I am there, physically, undeniably there, my mouth on her throat, my arms around her body. My presence so complete that there is no room for anything else, no room for thought or doubt or the careful negotiations of ordinary intimacy. In that moment, we are not two separate beings maintaining a respectful distance. We are entangled, merged. I am inside her, and she is inside me. Her blood becomes my blood. Her life becomes my life, however briefly. That is proximity. That is the collapse of the boundary between self and other. And you may call it violation, but I call it union. Your poets understand this, even if your moralists do not. Your poets speak of love as fusion, as the dissolution of separateness. They speak of lovers as one flesh, as two souls in one body. They use the language of consumption. I could eat you up, they say. You take my breath away. I'm starving for you. They know. They know that intimacy is not polite. It is not safe. It is not a matter of two complete individuals choosing to share space while maintaining their essential separateness. Real intimacy is hunger. It is the desire to be so close that boundaries dissolve. It is the willingness to consume and be consumed, to take and be taken, to lose oneself in the other and find oneself transformed. I simply enact literally what your poets describe metaphorically. And yes, there is danger in that proximity. Yes, there is the risk of harm. But show me an intimacy without risk. Show me a love that does not threaten to undo you, to change you, to take something from you that you cannot get back. You cannot, because intimacy is always dangerous. It is always a form of vulnerability, of exposure, of allowing another person close enough to wound you. I am simply honest about the wound. Now we come to the most difficult part of my argument, the part that will seem, I suspect, most perverse to your ears. I claim that hunger is devotion, that the act of feeding is not merely recognition, not merely proximity, but a form of profound commitment to the other. Let me explain. Devotion, in your world, is measured by sacrifice, by what one is willing to give up for the beloved, by the ways one subordinates one's own needs to the needs of the other. But I ask, is that truly devotion, or is it simply a more palatable form of self-erasure? True devotion, I would argue, is not the denial of one's own hunger, but the alignment of one's hunger with the other. It is the recognition that one's deepest need and the other's deepest reality are bound together. That to feed one's hunger is not to destroy the beloved, but to honor them, to take them into oneself so completely that they become part of one's very substance. When I fed on Laura, I did not do so casually. I did not treat her as one treats a meal consumed in haste and forgotten. I fed on her slowly, carefully, returning again and again. I made her the center of my existence. I organized my time, my thoughts, my very being around her. Is that not devotion? I could have fed on anyone. I could have moved from victim to victim, taking what I needed and moving on. But I did not. I stayed. I returned. I made Laura the singular focus of my hunger, and in doing so, I made her the singular focus of my life. She mattered to me, not as an abstraction, not as a symbol, but as the specific person whose blood I craved, whose presence I needed, whose life became entangled with mine in ways that could not be undone. There is a passage in the account of my time with Laura, a passage where I speak to her of love and death. I tell her, "You must come with me, loving me to death, or else hate me, and still come with me, and hating me through death and after." Your scholars read this as a threat, as evidence of my monstrosity, but I meant it as a promise, as a vow of devotion. I was saying, I will not leave you. I will not abandon you. Whether you love me or hate me, whether you come willingly or reluctantly, I will be with you. I will bind myself to you so completely that not even death will separate us. Is that not the language of devotion? Is that not what lovers promise one another, to be together beyond death, beyond change, beyond all the forces that might pull them apart? I know what you are thinking. You are thinking. But she was brought to the brink of death. How can you call that devotion? And I answer, all devotion ends in death. All love, if followed to its conclusion, leads to loss. Either you die, or the beloved dies, or you both die. There is no love that does not end in separation, in grief, in the terrible knowledge that intimacy is temporary. I simply compress the timeline. I make explicit what is implicit in all your loves, that to be devoted to someone is to be willing to consume them, to take them into yourself so completely that their loss becomes your loss, their death becomes your death. When I fed on Laura, I was not destroying her. I was making her part of me. I was ensuring that she would live on in my blood, in my body, in the very substance of my being. Is that not a form of immortality? Is that not a kind of love? You may say, but she did not choose this. She did not ask to be consumed. And I say, did she not? Did she not seek my company? Did she not lie beside me, night after night, knowing on some level what I was? Did she not feel the pull of my hunger and answer it with her own longing? Laura wanted to be consumed. She wanted to be the object of such intense devotion that it would undo her, transform her, take her beyond the narrow confines of her ordinary life. She simply did not want to admit it. She wanted to be devoured while maintaining the fiction that she was innocent, that she was a victim, that she bore no responsibility for the intimacy we shared. But I will not grant her that fiction. I will not pretend that what happened between us was one-sided, that I was the only one who hungered. She hungered too, for me, for the intensity I offered, for the promise of a love so complete that it would consume her entirely. And I gave her that. I devoted myself to her. I made her the center of my existence, the object of my most profound need, the person whose life became inseparable from my own. That is devotion. That is love. That is the intimacy of hunger. I anticipate your objections. Let me address them. You will say, but people died. Young women sickened and died because of you. How can you call that love? I answer, people die in all relationships. They die of heartbreak, of loneliness, of the slow erosion of being unloved. They die of the violence of indifference, of being seen as interchangeable, of being used without being recognized. At least those I fed upon were seen, were chosen, were the objects of genuine hunger, genuine need, genuine devotion. Is it better to die slowly of neglect than quickly of being too intensely loved? You will say, but you took from them without giving back. You consumed without being consumed. The relationship was asymmetrical. I answer, all relationships are asymmetrical. There is always one who loves more, one who needs more, one who gives more. The fantasy of perfect reciprocity is just that, a fantasy. And besides, I did give. I gave my presence, my attention, my devotion. I gave the gift of being seen, of being chosen, of being the singular object of another's hunger. Is that nothing? You will say, but you are a monster. You are not human. You cannot love as humans love. I answer, perhaps that is true. Perhaps my love is monstrous. But I have watched your human loves, and I am not convinced they are less monstrous than mine. I have seen how you devour one another in the name of love, how you consume one another's time, attention, autonomy, how you feed on one another's validation, one another's bodies, one another's lives. I have seen marriages that are slow vampirisms, one partner draining the other over decades, taking and taking until nothing remains. I have seen parents consume their children, lovers consume one another, friends feed on one another's misery. The only difference is that you do it slowly. You do it with the veneer of respectability. You do it while pretending that you are not hungry, that you are not taking, that you are not engaged in the same fundamental act of consumption that I enact with my teeth. I am not asking you to approve of me. I am not asking you to condone what I have done. I am asking you to recognize that hunger is not the opposite of love. That intimacy is not the opposite of consumption. That the desire to take another person into oneself, to be so close that boundaries dissolve, to need someone so intensely that their absence would be a kind of death, that this is not monstrosity. It is simply honesty about what intimacy is. Let me return to my thesis. Hunger is not violence. Hunger is relationship. I have argued that hunger is recognition, the act of seeing another as worthy of one's deepest need. I have argued that hunger is proximity, the collapse of distance, the demand for presence, the vulnerability of being close enough to wound and be wounded. I have argued that hunger is devotion, the commitment to another so complete that their life becomes inseparable from one's own. These are not the characteristics of violence. They are the characteristics of intimacy. I know that I will not persuade you. I know that you will leave this room convinced that I am a monster, that my hunger is a perversion, that what I call love is simply predation dressed in prettier language. But I ask you to consider, when you next feel hunger for another person, when you next feel the pull of desire, the need for closeness, the longing to consume and be consumed, remember what I have said. Remember that hunger is not shameful. It is not a failure of morality or self-control. It is the most honest expression of our need for one another. And perhaps, in that moment, you will understand what I have been trying to tell you, that we are all vampires. We all feed on one another. We all hunger for intimacy so intense that it threatens to undo us. I simply refuse to pretend otherwise. Thank you for listening. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect understanding. But I hope, at least, that you will remember. I saw them. I chose them. I devoted myself to them. And in my world, that is love.
The recording ends here. What follows is a contextual note drawn from the surviving record. That was Carmilla, or rather, that was what Carmilla might have said if Le Fanu had permitted her to articulate a complete defense. The primary text, Le Fanu's Carmilla, published serially in 1871 through 72, contains no record of Carmilla delivering philosophical testimony in her own voice. The documented version describes the following. Baron Wardenberg, a scholar of vampirism, arrived at the Schloss where Laura and her father resided. He identified Carmilla as Mircalla, Countess Karnstein, a vampire who had lived for centuries. He located her ancestral tomb in the ruined chapel of Karnstein. The grave was opened. Carmilla's body was found preserved, unchanged, her eyes open. A stake was driven through her heart. Her head was struck from her body. The remains were burned to ash. The documented account, filtered through Laura's retrospective narration, describes this as necessary destruction, the restoration of order, the elimination of a predatory threat. For decades, early criticism treated Carmilla primarily as Gothic atmosphere and narrative device, a seductive threat but not a philosophical subject worthy of serious examination. Carmilla functioned as Gothic monstrous, psychological horror. Early critical commentary referenced her primarily as evidence of the author's skill in creating suspense, the female vampire interpreted as symbol of forbidden desire, of sexual threat, of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of polite society. The scholarly record indicates a shift beginning in the mid-20th century. Feminist literary criticism began documenting alternative interpreted frameworks. Critics noted that Carmilla predated Bram Stoker's Dracula by 25 years, yet had been systematically overshadowed in vampire scholarship. The documented analysis revealed patterns. Where Dracula's threat was explicitly coded as foreign invasion and sexual violence, Carmilla's threat was more ambiguous, intimate, seductive, relational. Her feeding was described in the novel with language of affection, devotion, even love. Laura's account oscillates between horror and longing, between revulsion and desire. The critical reframing positioned Carmilla not as simple monster, but as figure of transgressive female desire, specifically desire between women. The documented textual evidence was substantial. Carmilla's speeches to Laura, "You are mine, you shall be mine, you and I are one forever," employed the rhetoric of romantic devotion. Her feeding was described with language of affection and tenderness, even as the experience remained frightening and destructive. The novel's horror derived not from explicit violence, but from the intensity of attachment, the collapse of boundaries between self and others. Queer literary theory expanded this framework further. Critics documented how 19th-century vampire fiction encoded same-sex desire as supernatural threat. The vampire became a figure through which authors could explore intimacies that could not be named directly. Carmilla's relationships with young women, her insistence on proximity, her declarations of devotion, her physical intimacy, represented what Victorian culture could not acknowledge: women who desired other women, who formed primary attachments outside heterosexual marriage, whose hunger was directed toward their own sex. The documented pattern revealed: by coding this desire as monstrous, by framing Carmilla's hunger as supernatural evil requiring destruction, the text avoided confronting what she actually represented. The stake through the heart was not simply the elimination of a vampire, it was the violent suppression of a philosophy that insisted desire between women could be profound, consuming, legitimate. Recent scholarship has documented additional layers. Literary historians examining the publication context note that Carmilla appeared during a period of increasing anxiety about female autonomy, about women's education and mobility, about relationships between women that existed outside male supervision. The documented evidence demonstrates how vampire fiction functioned as cultural mechanism for managing these anxieties. The female vampire represented the woman who refused containment, who moved freely, who chose her own companions, who insisted on her own desires. Contemporary criticism treats Carmilla not as literary symbol, but as subject, someone whose philosophy, though fictional, corresponds to documented historical patterns. Real women whose desire for other women was pathologized, real intimacies that were classified as deviant, dangerous, requiring intervention. The diagnosis of moral insanity, the treatment protocols for excessive female attachment, the systematic erasure of women's romantic friendships from acceptable discourse. The critical record reveals a documented paradox. Carmilla's textual destruction paradoxically amplified her influence in vampire literature. Her silencing in the novel became conspicuous enough to generate interpretive pressure. Every subsequent vampire narrative that treated feeding as seduction, that suggested intimacy between vampire and victim, that coded vampirism as erotic rather than simply violent, these narratives were responding to the framework Carmilla established. Anne Rice's vampires with their intense emotional bonds, the romantic vampires of contemporary fiction who insist their hunger is a form of love, the persistent association between vampirism and desire that refuses conventional boundaries. Carmilla's philosophy that hunger is intimacy, that feeding is recognition and devotion, was never permitted full articulation in Le Fanu's text. But it survived in fragments, in her speeches to Laura, in the ambiguous alternations of Laura's memory, in the textual gaps where her perspective might have existed. The reconstruction you've just heard represents one response to that documented absence. It is interpretive, yes, speculative. We possess no verified record of what Carmilla would have said in full defense of her philosophy because the author provided no such testimony. But the scholarly method involves examining silences, reading gaps, reconstructing worldviews from fragments of dialogue, from documented actions, from the implications of what the text refuses to say directly. The mechanisms Carmilla's reconstructed testimony describes, how hunger is pathologized, how desire is classified as predation, how intimacy that violates social boundaries is framed as monstrosity requiring elimination, these patterns remain documented in contemporary practice. The historical record demonstrates continuity. Certain forms of desire continue to be dismissed as deviant. Certain intimacies continue to be pathologized rather than recognized. The power to define what constitutes legitimate love continues to function as an instrument of control. Contemporary documentation shows persistent patterns. Women who express desire too openly, who refuse to apologize for their hunger, continue to be labeled threatening. Queer intimacies continue to be described in language that emphasizes danger, predation, the corruption of innocence. Desire that exists outside sanctioned frameworks continues to be treated as something requiring management, correction, containment. The question Carmilla's case raises, who is permitted to name their own desire, whose hunger is classified as legitimate, whose intimacy is recognized as love rather than pathology, remains unresolved in the documented record. It continues to be contested. The voices from cultural margins, from spaces of transgression, the voices classified as too dangerous or too deviant to warrant serious consideration, the historical record suggests these are frequently the voices articulating truths that centralized power cannot accommodate. Carmilla was destroyed in the chapel of Karnstein in 1872, but the documented critical discourse surrounding her philosophy, reconstructed, reclaimed, reinterpreted, has expanded continuously since. Not because textual erasure can be undone, but because scholarly practice can refuse to accept it as final. The archival imperative insists the woman who was staked and beheaded possessed a perspective worth documenting. Her philosophy merited preservation. Her argument deserved reconstruction on terms that centered her own logic. This is the function of ghost lectures. We preserve voices that were routinely denied. We reconstruct testimony that was never permitted to be delivered. We examined silences and documented what they might have contained. Carmilla's reconstructed lecture on the intimacy of hunger serves a dual archival purpose. First, documentation of how easily philosophy can be suppressed, how rapidly a coherent worldview can be reduced to monstrosity requiring elimination. Second, preservation of knowledge from transgressive margins, truths that can only be articulated from outside acceptable discourse. The documented pattern suggests the woman who insisted hunger was intimacy understood desire more honestly than those who destroyed her for naming it. The archival record recommends attention. Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature is written and narrated by me, Danielle Christmas, and produced by Audio Ellis. If you enjoyed this lecture, consider subscribing and sharing the recording with another lover of Gothic literature. Additional lectures will be released as new materials are recovered.